My name is Gabrielle Foster. I was 27 years old the day my sister called me a house guest in a room full of real estate executives. The signing conference room overlooked the Hudson River, 30 floors above Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling glass and a polished walnut table long enough to seat 20 people. Cameras stood near the far wall because the developer planned to release photographs of the contract signing later that afternoon. My sister Victoria stood confidently at the head of the table, dressed in a cream blazer, holding a gold pen she liked to use for closing ceremonies. She had built an entire reputation around moments like this one. When I stepped quietly into the room, she glanced at me and laughed lightly, the kind of laugh meant to invite others to join in. "Oh, don't mind her," she said to the group, gesturing toward me with a casual wave. "That's just my younger sister. She's basically a house guest these days." A faint ripple of laughter passed around the table. I didn't respond. I simply walked to an empty seat near the end of the table and placed a thin folder in front of me. Because the truth was that this entire project, the building, the contracts, the numbers everyone in that room was discussing, belonged to a story none of them understood yet. And in about 20 minutes, the room was going to learn who I actually was. The conference suite itself was designed to impress investors. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, reflecting off glass towers across the river. The polished table gleamed beneath modern pendant lights, while assistants moved quietly between chairs, placing leather folders beside each attendee. Several investors sat near the center reviewing spreadsheets on tablets, speaking in low voices about projected unit prices and construction costs. At the far side of the room, 2 reporters from a real estate magazine were adjusting camera equipment, preparing to capture photographs once the contracts were signed. The mood was confident and celebratory, the kind of atmosphere that usually surrounds a successful development project. For most people in the room, this meeting represented the final step in months of negotiations. For me, it was something entirely different. Victoria Langford stood exactly where everyone expected her to stand, next to the developer, smiling as she spoke with a pair of investors who had arrived from Chicago earlier that morning. She had spent nearly a decade building her reputation as one of New York's rising luxury condo brokers. Her Instagram account was filled with photographs of champagne glasses, penthouse balconies, and new owners receiving keys beneath glittering chandeliers. In each photo, she appeared confident and effortless, the perfect symbol of success in Manhattan's real estate world. Several investors greeted her like an old friend. One joked that she should receive half the credit for the building's marketing success because she had already introduced wealthy buyers to the project months before construction finished. Victoria laughed modestly and brushed away the compliment, but it was obvious she enjoyed being the center of attention. Across the room, my mother was speaking proudly with a small group of guests. She wasn't involved in the business side of the development, but Victoria had invited her to attend the ceremony anyway. My mother loved moments like this, rooms full of successful people listening to stories about her daughter's accomplishments. Whenever someone asked how Victoria had built her career so quickly, my mother leaned forward slightly and repeated the familiar explanation: ambition, determination, and a natural talent for closing deals. When the conversation eventually turned toward family, she gestured casually in my direction. "That's Gabrielle," she said. "My younger daughter. She's still figuring things out." The statement was delivered gently, almost kindly, but it carried the same quiet dismissal I had heard for years. A few people nodded politely before returning their attention to the discussion about property prices and market demand. No one asked another question. I remained silent, watching the room from my seat at the far end of the table. The developer was speaking with his legal team about the signing sequence while assistants arranged thick stacks of contracts in front of each investor. Victoria leaned comfortably against the back of her chair, whispering something that made the developer laugh softly. To everyone in the room, the structure of the meeting seemed simple. Investors would confirm the financial terms, the broker would finalize her agreements, and the project would move forward toward completion. But the version of the story they believed was incomplete. Inside the thin folder resting in front of me were several documents printed on plain white paper. One summarized the ownership structure of the investment fund that had recently stabilized the development's financing. Another outlined a set of legal notes regarding certain contract clauses that would soon require careful review. I didn't need to read them again. I already knew every detail by heart. At the front of the room, the lead attorney finally stood and cleared his throat, asking everyone to take their seats so the signing process could begin. Conversations faded quickly as investors opened their folders and turned their attention toward the legal summary projected on the screen. Victoria rested one hand on the back of her chair, smiling with quiet confidence as the meeting moved forward. My mother folded her hands proudly in her lap, and no one noticed the quiet woman sitting at the end of the table whose name would soon appear in the most important document in the room. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Boston, where most houses looked almost identical. Two-story homes lined narrow streets, each with small front lawns and maple trees planted along the sidewalks. From the outside, our neighborhood looked peaceful and ordinary. But inside our house, success had a very specific meaning. My mother believed the clearest measure of achievement was property, how high the ceilings were, how many floors a building had, and how much buyers were willing to pay per square foot. Real estate prices were discussed at our dinner table the way other families talked about sports scores. When neighbors renovated kitchens or bought larger homes, my mother followed the details carefully. She spoke about square footage and market value with the kind of admiration other parents reserved for academic awards. From the time I was young, she made it clear that one of her daughters already understood how to succeed in that world. My sister Victoria was 10 years older than I was, and by the time I entered high school, she had already begun building the reputation that would eventually define her career. She had a natural ability to speak with confidence, especially around wealthy people. While many young brokers struggled to attract clients, Victoria somehow convinced developers and investors that she could sell luxury apartments before construction was even finished. She moved to New York in her 20s and quickly positioned herself inside the world of high-end condominium sales. Over time, she developed a routine that became part of her personal brand. When a deal closed, she posed beside the new owner holding a gold-colored key and a glass of champagne. Photographs from those moments appeared on social media within hours, usually with captions about ambition and success. Many of those pictures were taken on balconies overlooking Central Park or inside penthouses with glass walls facing the skyline. To my mother, those images represented everything she believed success should look like. Whenever Victoria returned home to visit, our house seemed to transform into a celebration of her career. My mother prepared elaborate dinners and invited relatives over so Victoria could tell stories about the latest properties she had sold. People leaned forward at the table while she described marble kitchens, rooftop gardens, and private elevators opening directly into penthouse living rooms. My mother listened with visible pride, repeating parts of those stories to anyone who hadn't heard them yet. The pattern rarely changed. Victoria spoke, the room admired her accomplishments, and the conversation revolved around her experiences in New York. I usually sat quietly near the end of the table, finishing my meal while the others talked. No one treated me unkindly, but it was obvious where the attention belonged. Victoria had already become the symbol of ambition in our family. While she was building her reputation in luxury real estate, I found myself drawn to something much quieter. I became interested in finance, especially the way large investment funds managed assets behind the scenes. When I first mentioned this during my senior year of high school, the reaction around the table was mostly confusion. My mother asked what that meant exactly. I tried explaining how asset management firms invested in real estate projects, companies, and financial instruments over long periods of time. But compared with Victoria's glamorous stories about penthouses and wealthy buyers, my explanation sounded abstract. One of my relatives joked that it sounded like the kind of job nobody could easily describe at family gatherings. My mother smiled politely and summarized my plans in a single sentence she would later repeat often. Gabrielle has ambitious ideas. The tone made it clear she believed those ideas were unrealistic. When I turned 17, our family changed in a way none of us expected. My father died in a construction accident outside Boston. The phone call arrived one afternoon while I was finishing homework at the kitchen table. Everything that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself had lost a steady rhythm. My father had always been the calm presence between my mother and the rest of the world. He rarely argued with her opinions, but his quiet support softened the intensity of her expectations. After he was gone, that balance disappeared. My mother began focusing even more intensely on Victoria's achievements. Whenever my sister closed a major sale in New York, my mother talked about it for weeks. Those accomplishments became proof that our family was still moving forward. Gradually, a quiet narrative formed around the two of us. Victoria was described as the daughter who had already proven herself in a competitive world. I was described as the younger sibling still searching for direction. When relatives asked about Victoria, my mother proudly listed the buildings she had helped sell. When they asked about me, my mother usually paused before answering. "She's still figuring things out," she would say gently. At first, I didn't question the difference. Families often compare siblings in subtle ways, but over time, the contrast became stronger. Victoria became the example of success everyone pointed to, and I became the quiet reminder that not every story moved as quickly as hers did. I was 18 the first time money quietly divided my life into before and after. My grandmother had passed away during the winter of my senior year of high school, leaving behind a small estate and a custodial fund she had created specifically for my college education. The account wasn't enormous by Manhattan standards, $60,000, but to me, it meant everything. It meant I could attend university without beginning adulthood buried under debt. My grandmother had always believed I would work with numbers one day. She liked to say that I listened to financial conversations the way other children listened to stories. When my mother first mentioned the account after the funeral, she described it as my grandmother's final gift to help me build a future. For a short time, I believed that future had already begun. 2 months before I was scheduled to move into my college dorm, my mother asked me to sit down with her in the kitchen after dinner. The evening felt unusually quiet. She spoke gently, explaining that the investment account connected to my grandmother's fund had been affected by a downturn in the market. According to her, the financial advisor managing the account had placed the money into investments that failed unexpectedly. She told the story calmly, as if it were simply an unfortunate piece of financial news. "The market collapsed," she said. "It happens sometimes." I remember sitting at the kitchen table staring at the wood grain beneath my hands while the words settled around me. Victoria leaned against the counter nearby, scrolling through her phone with only mild interest in the conversation. By the end of the evening, the explanation had become simple and final. The money was gone. Within weeks, I began filling out student loan forms and financial aid applications. The process felt strangely routine, as if the system already expected young people to begin their adult lives in debt. That fall, I moved into a small dorm room, knowing that every semester would add another line to the balance I would eventually have to repay. To keep up with expenses, I started working evening shifts at a small restaurant near campus. I carried trays, cleared tables, and wiped counters until midnight. After work, I often returned to the library to finish assignments before classes began again in the morning. During the day, I searched for internships at finance firms, even though most of them offered no pay at all. My schedule became a constant rotation of classes, work, and exhaustion. Still, I rarely complained. I believed the explanation my mother had given me. Markets failed sometimes, investments disappeared. I assumed I had simply been unlucky. While I was learning to live on a tight budget, Victoria's life was moving in the opposite direction. She had relocated to New York and begun working with a brokerage that specialized in luxury condominium sales. Within a few years, her career started accelerating. Photographs of her closing deals began appearing regularly online, Victoria standing beside wealthy buyers holding champagne glasses and smiling beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. My mother proudly shared those photos with relatives and neighbors. She described Victoria as someone who understood opportunity better than anyone else in the family. When people asked about me, the explanation was shorter. "Gabrielle is still studying," my mother would say. "She's working hard." For several years, I accepted that version of events without questioning it. Everything changed during my final year of professional training. One evening, I received an unexpected email from a distant uncle I hadn't spoken to in years. The message itself was brief and almost hesitant. He explained that while organizing old family financial records, he had come across a document he believed I should see. Attached to the email was a scanned bank statement. At first, the numbers looked ordinary. Dates, balances, and deposits made over several years. I recognized the account immediately. It was the custodial fund my grandmother had established for my education. The balance had grown slowly over time until it reached just over $60,000 shortly before my 18th birthday. Then the pattern stopped. Near the bottom of the document, one line showed a single transaction that withdrew the entire balance in one movement. The date caught my attention immediately. It was not during a market crash. It was not during any period of financial instability. The withdrawal had been made only 2 weeks before a property purchase that had changed Victoria's career. Around that time, my sister had announced she was buying a small but elegant condominium in New York to use as a model residence for potential buyers. That apartment later became the centerpiece of her marketing image as a luxury broker. According to the bank statement, the person who authorized the withdrawal was my mother. The market hadn't erased the fund. It had simply been taken. I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading the numbers until the meaning became impossible to avoid. The $60,000 my grandmother left for my education had quietly financed the beginning of my sister's brand. The bank statement stayed open on my laptop screen long after midnight. I read the numbers again and again, hoping that somewhere between the columns of dates and balances I had misunderstood something. But the document was precise. Deposits from my grandmother had accumulated steadily over the years until the account reached $60,000. Then the pattern ended with a single withdrawal that emptied the balance completely. The authorization line carried my mother's name. For a long time, I didn't move. The apartment around me was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside the window. I had expected the document my uncle sent to confirm the story my mother told years earlier, that the money had disappeared in the market. Instead, the numbers revealed something much simpler. The money had not been lost. It had been taken. The detail that unsettled me most wasn't the withdrawal itself, it was the timing. The transaction date appeared only 2 weeks before my sister announced she had purchased her first apartment in New York. At the time, Victoria described it as a smart investment, a place she would use as a demonstration unit to impress potential buyers. She called it a model residence, a space where wealthy clients could experience the lifestyle she was selling. That apartment soon appeared in nearly every photograph she posted online. Champagne glasses on the balcony, golden sunlight through floor-to-ceiling windows, Victoria smiling beside clients while holding polished keys. The more I studied the bank statement, the clearer the timeline became. The money my grandmother had saved for my education had quietly financed the first stage of my sister's brand. For several days after discovering the document, I carried the knowledge like a secret weight. I considered calling my mother immediately. I imagined placing the bank statement in front of her and asking for an explanation she could not avoid. But every version of that conversation ended the same way in my mind. She would deny the details or reinterpret them. She might say the money had only been borrowed temporarily. She might claim it had been necessary for the family. Victoria would support her version of events, whether she knew the truth or not. And eventually the conversation would stop being about the withdrawal at all. It would become about my reaction. In my family, the person who controlled the story usually controlled the outcome. That realization changed something in me. For years, I had listened quietly while my mother shaped the way people described her daughters. Victoria was the successful broker whose ambition had carried her to New York. I was the younger sister still searching for direction. If I suddenly accused her of taking my college fund, the accusation would collide with a narrative everyone already believed. The truth would become another argument. Late that evening, I closed my laptop and walked outside my apartment building. The air was cold, and the streetlights reflected off damp pavement from earlier rain. I stood there for several minutes thinking about the different paths in front of me. One path led to confrontation. It would involve anger, accusations, and the possibility of exposing the truth immediately. The other path required patience. Instead of arguing about the past, I could build a future that would eventually reveal the truth without needing to shout it. The second option felt slower and far less satisfying in the moment. But it had one advantage the first path did not. It created leverage. When I returned to my apartment that night, I opened a blank notebook and began writing down ideas about the career I wanted to build. I listed the areas of finance that interested me most: asset restructuring, distressed real estate, and long-term investment strategies that turned overlooked properties into valuable assets. Those fields shared one important characteristic. Influence did not come from publicity, it came from ownership. The more I studied the financial world, the more clearly I saw the difference between appearance and control. Brokers and marketers stood in front of cameras celebrating successful deals, but the people who truly shaped those deals often remained invisible. They were the investors whose names appeared inside the contracts. Over the following months, I began preparing for the Chartered Financial Analyst exams and searching for work inside investment firms that handled complex real estate financing. While Victoria built her reputation through closing ceremonies and public deals, I focused on understanding the structures behind those transactions: capital stacks, equity percentages, debt agreements, and voting rights hidden inside legal documents. That perspective changed the way I saw the entire industry. Luxury apartments and penthouse views were only the visible surface. Behind them existed a much deeper financial ecosystem where decisions were made quietly and influence rarely appeared in photographs. Before going to sleep that night, I returned to the bank statement and saved several copies. One went onto a secure drive, another into a private email account. I printed a copy and placed it in a sealed envelope inside my desk drawer. I didn't know exactly when the document would matter, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the moment arrived, I would need proof. And the next time my family's story about me appeared in a room full of people, the truth would be written somewhere no one could erase it. After discovering the truth behind the missing college fund, I stopped thinking about my career as a simple job and began treating it like a long strategy. The financial world was larger than the polished stories people told about it. Luxury apartments, glossy marketing brochures, and smiling brokers were only the visible surface. Beneath that surface existed a network of investors, funds, and contracts that determined who actually controlled the projects everyone else celebrated. If money and property were the language my family understood best, I decided I would learn to speak that language fluently. My first serious opportunity came from a small asset management firm in Boston. The company occupied 2 modest floors in an older office building in the financial district. It didn't have a glamorous reputation or a recognizable brand. Most of its work involved analyzing troubled investments that larger institutions had abandoned. At first glance, the job seemed quiet and unremarkable, but it turned out to be the perfect place to learn how the real estate market actually worked. Instead of selling properties, we studied them. Developments that looked impressive from the outside often carried complicated financial structures beneath the surface. Loans layered on top of loans, investors with competing priorities, and construction schedules that collapsed the moment financing slowed down. When projects stalled, our firm evaluated whether they could still become profitable if the financial structure was reorganized. My job in the beginning was simple. I reviewed documents, compiled reports, and examined the details behind struggling real estate developments across several cities. Most of the projects had stopped moving forward because developers ran out of money or lenders demanded repayment earlier than expected. Buildings that once looked like promising investments had turned into complicated financial puzzles. To most people, those projects appeared like failures. To us, they were opportunities. Every distressed property carried a question. If the right capital entered the project at the right time, could the development still succeed? Answering that question required patience. Every contract clause, zoning restriction, and financing agreement could change the value of a property dramatically. The more I studied those details, the more I realized how different my world was from the one Victoria lived in. My sister sold the final result: the polished apartment, the skyline view, the champagne moment when keys changed hands. I was learning how the project existed long before that moment. During my second year at the firm, I began studying for the Chartered Financial Analyst certification. The exam material consumed nearly every evening after work: financial modeling, valuation methods, portfolio management theory. The process was demanding, but it sharpened my understanding of how large investment portfolios operated. Gradually, my supervisors began trusting me with more responsibility. Instead of only gathering research, I started presenting recommendations about which distressed projects the firm should consider acquiring or refinancing. Some of those recommendations turned into profitable investments. When a struggling development recovered value after restructuring, the results were visible in the numbers. Each successful decision strengthened my credibility. By the time I turned 25, a new idea began forming in my mind. Many large institutions ignored complicated real estate investments because they appeared risky at first glance. But those same projects often contained valuable assets hidden beneath temporary financial problems. With patient capital and careful restructuring, they could become extremely profitable. I spent months developing a plan for an independent firm focused entirely on that strategy. Eventually, I gathered a small group of investors who believed in the concept. Together, we launched a company called Foster Capital Asset Management. The firm started modestly, with a small team and a limited amount of capital, but our approach was clear. We would focus on undervalued real estate projects, developments where the property itself remained strong even if the financing structure had collapsed. Within 2 years, Foster Capital began attracting larger institutional investors. Our early projects involved developments that had stalled during construction because funding disappeared halfway through the process. By reorganizing debt agreements and bringing in new capital partners, we helped restart construction and recover value that previous investors had assumed was lost. One project led to another. Gradually, the firm grew until we were managing more than $150 million in assets. And despite that growth, I kept our public presence intentionally quiet. Unlike Victoria's career, which depended on visibility and reputation, Foster Capital operated mostly behind the scenes. In many developments, our name appeared only inside legal documents rather than marketing materials. Then one afternoon, a new proposal appeared on my desk. The project involved a luxury condominium complex in Manhattan that had encountered financial trouble during its second construction phase. Rising costs and delays forced the developer to search for new investors willing to stabilize the project. At first, it looked like another routine, distressed opportunity. Then I noticed the name of the exclusive broker responsible for selling the building's luxury units, Victoria Langford, my sister. The proposal explained that the development still held strong market potential but required additional capital to move forward. I studied the numbers carefully over the next several days. The location was valuable, the design was strong, the financial problems were solvable. Most importantly, the developer was willing to offer a substantial ownership stake to the investor who stabilized the project. If Foster Capital entered the deal, we wouldn't simply observe the development. We would control a significant portion of it. After several weeks of negotiation, our firm agreed to purchase a 40% equity position through a structured investment fund. The agreement granted us voting authority over major financial decisions connected to the building. Because the investment was made through a private entity, my personal involvement never appeared in the project's public announcements. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary institutional investment. Victoria continued marketing the development to wealthy buyers, completely unaware that the capital holding the project together now belonged to a company led by the younger sister she rarely mentioned. The long strategy I began the night I discovered the bank statement was finally moving into the same room as my sister's career. The attorney asked everyone to take their seats, and the quiet conversations around the conference table gradually faded. Papers slid across polished wood as assistants placed document folders in front of each participant. I had already been sitting there for several minutes, watching the room settle into the calm rhythm of a professional signing ceremony. From the outside, the meeting looked routine. Investors reviewed financial projections, the developer spoke quietly with his legal team, and my sister stood confidently near the center of the room as if the entire project naturally revolved around her. Langford Heights was preparing to finalize agreements for the second phase of construction. The building had already attracted attention in Manhattan's luxury market because of its location and design. Floor-to-ceiling glass, private terraces, and unobstructed views across the Hudson River were the features highlighted in every marketing brochure. Victoria had spent months presenting those details to wealthy buyers who wanted exclusive apartments above the city. For most people in the room, the meeting represented the final step in a successful project. For me, it was something else entirely. Victoria stood beside the developer, speaking with two investors who had flown in from Chicago earlier that morning. Her posture was relaxed, her voice confident. Over the years, she had developed a style that turned every business meeting into a small performance. She spoke about market demand, international buyers, and the prestige associated with owning property in Manhattan. When she described the penthouse units that would eventually crown the building, the investors listened carefully. To them, she was the visible face of the development. Across the room, my mother moved between small groups of guests, greeting people with polite enthusiasm. Victoria had invited her to attend the signing ceremony, partly because my mother enjoyed witnessing moments that celebrated her daughter's success. Whenever someone asked about Victoria's background, my mother leaned forward slightly and began explaining how hard her daughter had worked to build a career in New York's competitive real estate market. "She has incredible instincts," my mother told one investor proudly. "She knows exactly what buyers want." The conversation eventually turned toward family. One of the guests asked casually whether Victoria had siblings. My mother smiled and gestured lightly in my direction. "That's Gabrielle," she said. "My younger daughter. She's staying with friends while she figures out her next step." The explanation floated across the room as if it were a harmless detail. A few people nodded politely before returning their attention to the documents on the table. Victoria glanced toward me and laughed softly, the kind of laugh people use when they expect others to join in. "She likes watching how deals happen," she added casually. "Good exposure." A faint ripple of laughter moved around the table. None of it sounded cruel. The moment passed quickly, just another small comment in a busy room. I lowered my eyes briefly and allowed the conversation to continue without interruption. If I had corrected the story, the atmosphere would have changed instantly. People would have become uncomfortable, uncertain which version of events to believe. Instead, I let the room continue accepting the narrative it already understood. From my seat near the end of the table, I studied the investors reviewing the financial projections displayed on a large screen near the wall. The presentation outlined expected sale prices, construction timelines, and marketing costs for the remaining units. I recognized several of the investors from earlier meetings connected to the development. They were experienced professionals who understood the risks involved in large real estate projects. What they did not yet realize was that the financial structure supporting the building had changed several weeks earlier. The capital stabilizing the development had arrived quietly through an investment fund most of them had never heard of before. The lead attorney eventually stood and cleared his throat, asking everyone to direct their attention toward the legal documents placed in front of them. The signing ceremony, he explained, would begin with a formal confirmation of ownership stakes and voting rights associated with the second phase of construction. Assistants dimmed the lights slightly so the legal summary projected on the screen would be easier to read. Several investors leaned forward in their chairs while others flipped open their folders. Victoria remained relaxed, resting one hand lightly against the back of her chair while the attorney began reviewing the ownership structure behind the development. When he reached the section listing the investment partners involved in the restructuring, a few people glanced at one another as a new name appeared among the documents: Foster Capital Asset Management. The attorney paused briefly before continuing through the list of participating entities. To most people in the room, the name probably sounded like just another institutional investor participating in the project. No one appeared particularly curious about it. The truth was hidden behind the structure of the fund itself. The investment had been completed quietly, through legal entities designed to protect the identity of the controlling partner. The attorney turned another page in the document and looked toward the end of the table. I closed the folder resting in front of me and placed my hands lightly on the polished surface. Around the room, people continued reading financial summaries, unaware that the story they had been repeating about me for years was about to collide with the reality written inside the contracts lying on the table. The attorney reached the final section of the ownership summary and paused briefly before continuing. The room had grown quiet as investors followed the legal language projected on the screen. Papers rustled softly while several people turned the pages in their folders to match the section the attorney was reading aloud. He explained that a newly structured investment partner had acquired a 40% equity position in the Langford Heights development during the most recent financing round. The information sounded routine, the kind of update that appeared in nearly every large real estate project. Then he spoke the name of the investment firm, Foster Capital Asset Management. Several investors nodded politely. A few of them typed notes into their tablets. To most people in the room, it sounded like the arrival of another institutional fund participating in the project's financial structure. The attorney continued calmly, explaining that the firm specialized in restructuring complex real estate assets and had provided the capital necessary to stabilize the development during its second phase. Without that investment, construction might have stalled indefinitely. People listened carefully, but the room remained relaxed. No one yet understood the next part. The attorney turned one more page in the document folder and lifted his eyes toward the far end of the table where I was sitting. "Before we proceed with the final signature sequence," he said, "we would like to formally acknowledge the managing partner responsible for Foster Capital's participation in this development." The room waited politely. "Please welcome the Chief Executive Officer of Foster Capital Asset Management." For a moment, nothing happened. Several people looked around the table, expecting someone else to stand. A few investors glanced toward the developer, assuming the executive might be seated beside him. Others turned their heads toward the back of the room, where assistants and photographers were standing. I closed the folder in front of me. The quiet sound of my chair moving against the floor echoed softly as I stood. A few people frowned slightly, trying to understand why I was walking toward the center of the room. Victoria watched me approach with the same polite confusion the others shared. For a moment, she looked as though she expected someone else to rise behind me. No one did. I stopped beside the developer and extended my hand. He shook it immediately, his expression calm and professional. "Thank you for joining us today," he said. A silence settled over the room that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Investors leaned forward in their chairs, studying me with growing curiosity. The quiet woman who had been sitting unnoticed at the end of the table was now standing beside the developer as if she belonged there. Victoria's smile faded slowly. My mother looked from me to the attorney and then back again, waiting for someone to explain that there had been a mistake. No one spoke. The attorney resumed reading from the document in his hand. "Foster Capital holds a 40% equity position in the Langford Heights development," he said. "As managing partner of the firm, Ms. Gabrielle Foster retains voting authority over major financial decisions associated with the project." The words hung in the air. Victoria blinked once, then again, as if trying to process what she had just heard. "That can't be right," she said quietly. Her voice no longer carried the effortless confidence she usually brought into business meetings. The attorney remained calm. "The ownership structure is detailed in the agreements distributed to all investors," he replied. Victoria glanced down at the documents in front of her, flipping through several pages quickly. The realization arrived slowly across her face. Meanwhile, the investors began whispering among themselves, reviewing the same pages. The developer gestured toward the table and invited everyone to focus on the remaining contract sections before the signing could continue. I opened the folder I had carried with me and removed a printed document. "Before the signatures are finalized," I said evenly, "there is one clause Foster Capital would like reviewed." The room became quiet again. I slid the document toward the legal team. It contained a summary of brokerage commission terms connected to the condominium sales agreement. During our firm's due diligence process, my analysts had noticed that the commission percentage attached to several units exceeded the regulatory limits established under New York real estate law. Two attorneys leaned over the page and began reviewing the details carefully. The discussion that followed was quiet but intense. Lawyers compared clauses, checked regulatory guidelines, and examined the percentages listed in the contract. Several investors watched the exchange with growing attention. After a few minutes, one of the attorneys looked up. "It appears the commission structure will need to be revised," he said. The developer nodded slowly. Victoria remained standing near the head of the table, staring at the documents as if the numbers had rearranged themselves overnight. No one laughed anymore. When the legal team confirmed that the clause required correction, I closed my folder and rested it on the table. I didn't look directly at my sister. Instead, I spoke calmly to the room. The contract speaks for itself. The conference room felt different after the lawyers finished reviewing the revised clauses. The earlier laughter had disappeared, replaced by a careful silence that settled over the table like a change in weather. Investors leaned closer to their documents, reading every page more slowly than before. The developer spoke quietly with his legal team, confirming that the new wording complied with the regulatory limits we had just discussed. No one rushed anymore. The atmosphere had shifted from celebration to precision. Victoria stood beside the table reading the updated agreement with controlled concentration. The confidence she carried into the room earlier had faded into something quieter. She followed each paragraph carefully, pausing several times as if hoping the text might change if she read it again. Across the table, my mother sat motionless, her hands folded together while she stared at the documents in front of her. For once, she had no explanation ready, no story to smooth over what had just happened. The attorneys eventually finished preparing the final version of the agreement. One of them placed the documents neatly in front of the developer and nodded. "We're ready to proceed with signatures." The developer thanked the legal team and turned toward the participants around the table. One by one, the relevant parties stepped forward to sign the updated contracts. Investors confirmed their participation in the project, and the developer finalized the revised financial structure that would allow the second phase of construction to continue. When it was Victoria's turn, the attorney slid the brokerage agreement toward her. She read the new commission terms slowly. The revised structure brought the percentages within the limits required under New York law and added a transparency clause explaining the financial arrangement to future buyers. It was a straightforward correction, the kind that happens in careful legal reviews. Still, the moment felt heavier than it should have. Victoria picked up the pen resting beside the document. For years, she had stood in rooms like this, celebrating successful closings, raising champagne glasses, and posing for photographs beside clients. This time, there were no cameras flashing and no applause waiting. After a few seconds, she signed the page. The act itself was small, but the meaning was unmistakable. For the first time in her career, she was finalizing a deal under the financial authority of the younger sister she had once dismissed as insignificant. When the final signature was placed on the last page, the attorney confirmed that the agreement had been officially completed. Construction on the next phase of the development could move forward according to the revised plan. Chairs slid back from the table as investors began gathering their belongings. Conversations restarted quietly, this time focused on construction schedules and marketing strategies for the remaining units. Several people approached me to introduce themselves more formally, curious about the investment firm that had entered the project so quietly. I answered their questions politely, keeping the conversation focused on the development itself. Across the room, Victoria avoided my eyes. My mother remained seated until most of the room had emptied. Before leaving, I handed a sealed envelope to the attorney representing my firm. Inside was a formal notice addressed to my mother requesting repayment of the $60,000 originally withdrawn from the custodial account created for my education, along with the interest required under civil law. Attached to the notice was a copy of the original bank statement. There was no argument, no raised voices, just documentation. Outside the building, the late afternoon light reflected off the glass towers along the river. The city looked exactly the same as it had earlier that day. Cars moved through traffic, pedestrians crossed busy streets, and cranes stood above nearby construction sites preparing for the next generation of buildings. For years, my sister believed success lived in the spotlight, in photographs of closing ceremonies and elegant views from penthouse balconies. For a long time, my mother believed the same thing, but real power rarely arrives with applause. It appears quietly in contracts, ownership percentages, and signatures that determine who controls the future of a project. That afternoon, I didn't need to argue with anyone in my family about what had happened years earlier. The documents spoke clearly enough. Later that evening, I placed the signed development agreement inside a secure cabinet in my office, beside the printed copy of the bank statement that had started this entire journey. The two pieces of paper looked ordinary, but together they told a story about patience, time, and the quiet kind of leverage people rarely notice until it's too late. And if you've ever had a moment in your life when someone underestimated you, when people believed a version of your story that wasn't really true, you probably understand why some victories don't require shouting. Sometimes the strongest response is simply letting the truth arrive in a room where no one can ignore it. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment when the truth about your life finally changed the way people saw you? Share it in the comments. I read them all. And if you enjoy stories like this about quiet strength, family conflict, and the long road to justice, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.